It's 1815, and the Napoleonic Wars have just come to a close after a fantastic showing by the Swedes at the Battle of Waterloo. Wait, no, that's not right. 4 million people died. After over a decade of conflict, the still relatively new United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was taking some much needed time to celebrate its victory over France, and it did so in classic British style, by building a fuck-ton of monuments to commemorate the dead. London was straight out the gate, but not wanting to be left out, the elites in the respective provincial capitals of Edinburgh and Dublin, not Cardiff for obvious reasons, decided to construct monuments of their own. Whilst London's monument fell by the wayside, in 1816 prominent Tories within the Highland Society in Edinburgh took up the mantle and decided to construct a monument on Carlton Hill. They went through various designs, with Archibald Elliott's Roman-inspired Pantheon initially finding favour. However, after a coordinated effort by prominent Whigs within the city, public opinion was swayed to something a bit more Greek. The Whig elites were still riding high from the Enlightenment, a time of 18th century off-the-wall level learning and cultural development within the city, and they had already started to romanticise the period, seeing this monument not just as a war memorial, but as an opportunity to showcase the city's transformation, from provincial outpost to northern metropolis of culture and art, an Athens of the north, complete with the Parthenon rising above the city. Sorry, super quick, just want to jump in here. Let's talk about the Earl of Elgin, former ambassador to the Ottoman Empire and definitely not an art thief. He was a real fan of ancient Athenian antiquities, and while serving as a diplomat, decided to take it upon himself to copy some of the Acropolis's most awesome art. This was a pretty time-consuming task, so instead of doing that, he just started taking them back to Scotland for safekeeping in his mansion. They weren't there for long though. Pretty soon he had to sell them to the British government. In order to pay for the cost of obtaining the marbles? I don't know. Even back in the day, this was a pretty controversial endeavour, so much so that Lord Byron, a man who became infamous for having sex with his sister, allegedly, thought it was a bit much. Importantly for this story though, Elgin was a member of the Highland Society and recommended in 1822 that the committee responsible for the construction of the monument get in touch with Charles Robert Cockerell, an English architect who had just returned from a grand tour of Greece. He suggested that Cockerell should come and inspect the site to check its suitability for such a grand structure. Instead, Cockerell spent 3 weeks trying to convince the committee that his plans were the way to go, and by August 1822, Elliott and his amended designs were out and Cockerell was in. Just in time for the King's visit. George IV's visit to Scotland promised to be a monumental occasion, and was really meant to get that Monument Moolah party started. It was the first visit by a reigning monarch to Scotland since 1652. 1652, is that right?
That's insane.
And whilst the King wasn't particularly popular up here, or anywhere for that matter, it still promised to be a big crowd pleaser. With Walter Scott as Master of Ceremonies, the King's symbolic laying of a 6-ton foundation stone was sure to generate some much-needed national press for the project, and get the money rolling in. And that was something that was particularly important, because up until this point, they had raised basically nothing. But in a turn of events which shocked absolutely no one, on the day, the King didn't even show up. He was out in Dalkeith with everyone's favourite lord and future railway tycoon, the Duke of Buccleuch. Sure, the ceremony went ahead, it just lacked its centrepiece, and that meant the money didn't come rolling in. Unfettered in 1826, the Royal Association of Contributors to the National Monument of Scotland was incorporated by an Act of Parliament, and that was super cool, but it would have been even more cool if the British government had released funds to go along with the incorporation. The British economy was going through somewhat of a troubled time, and Lord Liverpool's administration didn't have money for massive vanity projects, unless they included the church. No matter though, the committee did a quick whip round, and after only raising 16,000 of the 42,000 supposedly needed to construct the monument, they decided that everything would probably be fine, and signed the first contract in 1826. Cockerell's original design was revised numerous times prior to the start of construction, and his exact recreation of the Athenian Parthenon started to look a little bit different. A church was once again added, the monument's orientation was flipped, and catacombs were integrated into the substructure, with the hope that wealthy Edinburghers would pay for the privilege of being buried above the riffraff of the city below. Its scale remained unchanged, however, and even by today's standards, the monument would have been pretty immense, and almost 70 metres long, 36 metres wide, and rising 25 metres from its foundation stone. This thing would have dominated the city's eastern skyline. Flanked by 46 enormous sandstone pillars, the committee needed a guy who knew how to get masonry on the cheap. And that man was William Henry Playfair, an architect so famous they named the Wetherspoons after him.
Wow.
Playfair was an up-and-coming Scottish architect, an odds-on favourite if you wanted something built on Carlton Hill. He had risen to prominence in 1817 by overseeing completion of the university's then new, now old college building, and his career had gone in leaps and bounds from then on. His appointment as on-site architect alongside Cockerell was never going to be a match made in heaven though. They had been rivals during the monument's earlier stages of development, but it was deemed essential by the big Whig backers as both a political and practical statement, a coming together of Scottish and English interests to form something greater than they could achieve on their own. What could possibly go wrong? In 1826, construction began, using the finest stone from a retail park in Craigleith. But progress was slow, marred by a meddling committee and the enormous resources needed to finish a project on this scale. Playfair's inexperience didn't help either. Sure, the man loved columns, but he was using Cockerell's designs, and frequently had to bring in experts in ancient Athenian architecture in order to get the desired finish. It took almost 2 years to construct the 12 pillars which stand behind me, and at its peak the project employed almost 300 workers. But like so many other Kickstarters that would follow it, pretty soon interest dwindled, contracts lapsed, and the money dried up. Even to the bitter end though, there were members of the committee who still thought the monument could be finished, but Playfair was less optimistic, writing in his June 1829 letter to Cockerell,
"Our Parthenon is come to a dead halt, and is, I am afraid, likely to stand up a striking proof of the pride and poverty of us Scots."
Like so many other large-scale capital projects in Edinburgh, the National Monument suffered from over-ambition, a lack of planning, and a seeming detachment from reality. The simple fact is that even if the committee had managed to raise the £42,000 supposedly needed to complete the venture, it likely wouldn't have been enough. And we actually have a pretty good frame of reference for this. The spookily similarly actually completed Walhalla Monument in Bavaria cost 20 times what was budgeted for the Scottish endeavour. Money was a big factor, but it wasn't the only reason why the project failed. At the time, Edinburgh was going through a massive process of expansion, and large-scale civic projects were popping up all across the capital. At this time, the public weren't interested in building a monument to an ever more distant war. That being said, the monument's failure left a pretty visible mark on the city's landscape, and soon became known to locals interchangeably as Scotland's folly and Edinburgh's disgrace. And whilst both Cockerell and Playfair moved on with their careers, and built some pretty impressive stuff in Edinburgh and beyond, including on Carlton Hill, the monument has remained the same, looking exactly as it did in 1829 when the workers downed tools. Various plans have been put forward over the last 2 centuries which would see the folly finished. These have included turning it into a monument to Queen Victoria, adapting it into a commemoration of the Act of Union, probably better that one didn't happen, making it our new National Gallery, and even turning it into our very own Scottish Parliament building. I can't think why they want to do that though. We have such a beautiful building already. Just like in the 1830s, the people of Edinburgh have other things to be concerned with right now. And some might argue that those concerns are more important than finishing a monument to a war that ended 200 years ago. But at the risk of sounding sentimental, the monument is fine. Hey, I'm back again to share the good word of Goodwrite. Not just because they asked me to, but because if you're a scientist looking for a site for your latest project, you shouldn't be stuck using a web template. Look at this guy. He's stuck with a web template, and now he hates his life. As men of science themselves, the team at Goodwrite are committed to making it simple for labs to get the word out, with a fully customizable website designed for science. With Goodwrite, there's no templates, no PR speak, or needless support tickets. They handle it all. Discover what they can do for you at goodwrite.org.